You didn't describe the role of religion in this whole controversy, and I'd like to hear your perspective on that.
Okay, I'll take one more question, and then what I'll have to do is we'll put the stand up here and have to line up. I think that's the best way to do it. Otherwise, I'll be confused. So let's get somebody here. Okay, up in front while we're at it.
Thank you very much. I agree with everything you said, with a few caveats. I'm forced to ask you as a devil's advocate, what do you realistically envision as the type of government and cultural changes that will be necessary to carry forth this perfect vision? For one thing, a lot of the formerly known as Sephardic Jews...
You mean what government will bring it, or what government?
Yeah, how is this going to be implemented on the ground? And to be devil's advocate in particular, shall we say that there are Palestinian groups that aren't known to be terribly democratic, small d either? I have to say this in all reality.
Okay, so we'll do these three, then we can do more. What I describe in the book is what I perceive to be a scary and dangerous environment, because that is how I was raised. And so I remember very vividly, there are two things that I describe very vividly. One is my first, and you may have been to Nazareth, my first trip to Nazareth, which is, of course, inside of Israel. They're all Israeli citizens. Almost everybody speaks Hebrew. Yet everybody's in Arab, and the signs are in Arabic. And it was the first time that I found myself alone in all these Arab, And then later on, an actual trip that I took, I drove by myself with an Israeli car, with Israeli license plates into the West Bank. And in both cases, particularly more the second one, I thought that was going to be my last day on earth. It's not because it was dangerous, it was because of this, what my sister calls a fear virus, that was implanted and is implanted in Israelis' minds very, very early on, and is typical in racist societies. The way racism is maintained is through fear and mistrust. And then what I found was that the more I let go of the fear, the more there was room for trust to come in. And this began in the dialogue group that I took part in San Diego. The less I was afraid, or the more I allowed myself to not be afraid, the more I allowed trust to come in. And then once trust replaces fear, then all kinds of bad things happen. The walls fall apart, there are no more divisions, there are no more us and they. So it's a very dangerous process. Today, so I drive the trip I took that I described in the book was from Jerusalem to Bilain. Bilain is a small town where they have weekly protests. It's where the nonviolent popular resistance began. It's like a mecca. People come there to almost just kiss the ground and see the people, because it's really become hallowed ground in many ways. I go there all the time. I mean, I went there in 2005 for the first time. I spend the night there. I have friends there and so forth. The first time I drove, all I saw was danger. Every hill I saw, I felt there was going to be somebody behind that hill with a machine gun ready to gun me down. Today, I see the olive trees. I see the flowers. I see these beautiful green rolling hills. This almost, biblical landscape of Palestine. So what changed was not the reality on the ground. What changed was this, because there was no reason for me to be afraid then. Of course, there's no reason for me to be afraid now. But the fear and the wall and the big signs when you cross into the West Bank at every checkpoint that warn Israelis that that crossing into Palestinian areas is a felony, it's life-threatening, and then at the end they have 2 or 3 exclamation marks. It's just to be sure that felony and death are very serious issues. And they're there, and you cross, and after the first time it's scary. The second time you start to wonder. The third time you say, well, are they out of why is this sign here? Where's the danger? So that's what I describe. The role of religion, that's a question I get a lot. I think people try to turn this into a religious conflict, and I think it's very important to understand that it's not. The conflict is one, or the issue is one of racist settler colonialism, which is what Zionism is. The Zionists secularized Judaism. They said Judaism is not a religion, it's a nationality. Then they secularized the Bible. They said it's not a book of faith, it's a book of history. All the God stuff and all the faith stuff is nonsense, but it's history. As a nation, this is our history book. And then they said, well, the land of Israel is our nation, is our country. And that's how they created this myth of the Jewish people and all of that. And the justification to go and bring Jews or have Jews colonize Palestine, which is not untypical. I think a lot of colonialist, racist, and settler ideologies rested on the Bible, used the Bible as an excuse. But of course, we can't ignore the fact that religion plays a role in Palestine, in the Holy Land. I think religion can play a very positive role. If you take Sabil, for example, if you take a man like Naim Atik, who I think is the future Desmond Tutu, I think is today's Desmond Tutu, really. Then you see the positive, powerful role that the religion can play. And there are others. There are Muslims and others that that are like that. But as we also know, religion can be very toxic. If we look at the settlers, for example, in Hebron, the very fanatic. What they did was, originally Zionism was very secular. After 1967, when Israelis had access to the heartland of biblical places, then there's this insane messianic wind started to blow. And all these religious nationalists began to emerge, and they were the first ones to go to Hebron and to Nablus and all these other places and establish take over and establish settlements there. That is a very toxic combination because they're armed. They don't care if they die in the process. They don't care how many. They're like very similar to the Taliban. They're kind of the Jewish, maybe more dangerous even. They're the Jewish version of the Taliban. They don't care if they die in the process. I think the role of religion could be either very positive and powerful, or can be very negative. I think it's important, though, to keep religion out of it, because it's a political issue. It's an issue of oppression, and has to be resolved on a political level, on a level of fighting oppression and fighting apartheid. And then people believe what they will, and they're free to come and believe and worship and so on. Now, realistically, I think that if we take a look at other examples, if we take a look at South Africa, for example, it didn't take anything special on the side of the South Africans. What it took was enough pressure from the outside world and a strong enough resistance from within to bring them down and to force de Klerk to come out and say one day, Nelson Mandela will be released unconditionally. All the political parties that are banned are going to be unbanned, which meant there will be elections, which meant apartheid is over. De Klerk didn't do this because he wanted it. He did it because he had no choice. There's going to be an Israeli... Now, the whites in South Africa certainly didn't welcome this. And I'm sure they feared it, but one day they woke up and that was the reality and that was it. They could stay or go. Most of them chose to stay. I think Israel is going to be a very similar situation, because the Israeli Jews, like myself, we're like the whites in South Africa. We're the descendants of settler colonizers, but we are there now. This is our home. And of course, no Israeli and no privileged person in the world willingly gives up their privilege or wants to share it. At the same time, I think as a result of Sabil and BDS and the overwhelming strength of the Palestinian voice and the voice for justice, there will be an Israeli prime minister, and again, I think it's going to be much sooner than most people anticipate, that will be forced to come up and say, well, the Palestinian prisoners will be released, and we're going to have free and fair one-person, one-vote elections in so-and-so month, in the next few months. Which means everybody gets to vote, which means that we will have a body that represents, a governing body that represents everybody who lives there. So that's going to be the process. Are there fanatics on the Palestinian side who probably won't like it? Sure. Are there fanatics on the Israeli side? I worry about them a little bit more because they're better armed and I think they're crazier. But then you have the rule of law, and we have experiences from other countries, what they did with fanatics who weren't willing to abide by the new reality. They can either leave or go to jail. So that's how I see it unfolding, and that's the realistic or kind of unfolding of events that I see.
If the next few people would come up and offer their questions, and then
We have a line going back there, you guys.
your line is back there, okay.
No, we don't want it.
We were back there, so we wouldn't block
Okay.
people's vision. Miko, thank you so much for your dedication and for being here.
Sure,
with us
thank you.
today. My question has to do with the misperceptions in our majority media. Our elected officials, including our state legislators, and many of whom go on to national elected office, there is really just the AIPAC narrative is very, very pervasive. And you started your program by saying how hopeful you are, and I know I speak for many when we say we need to hear these sources of hope. So I wonder what you consider to be the most effective actions that conscientious people in the U.S. Can continue to take to shift this erroneous perception of these issues among our media and elected officials, and who are still sending billions of dollars of aid of our money every year. Thank you.
Sure.
Second question.
I believe everyone that's in this room is looking forward, I am, to this one state respecting human rights. In what year will that be?
Hi. Okay, so you mentioned South Africa. The United States like to talk a lot about promoting democracy around the world. And we talked about Israel being the only democracy in the Middle East. But one of the issues that I think should be discussed, and I'd be curious your thoughts on, which are economic issues. I think there's a lot of people in South Africa right now who don't feel like their revolution was a success, because while they did gain political rights, one vote, they didn't gain the economic rights that the ANC had also been fighting for. Those were dropped. And it seems to me you can't have a democracy under an economic system where you don't even have a chance to run an office. We see this here in the United States. We don't really have a choice of who we get to pick. They basically choose for us. So if people don't have economic rights, and is there discussion about also economic rights in Palestine for Palestinians as well? Thanks.
Okay, I think that's 3. I'm tempted to start with the second one, but I'll hold myself. Okay, the first question was very good. You've said and asked lots of different things. The misperception in the media, I think the biggest misperception is that Israel is somehow some kind of a strategic asset to the U.S. And so you have to ask yourself the question, let's say that it was no longer Israel, but it was an Israel-Palestine, a democratic state, which I believe it will be. Okay, the first question was very good. You've said and asked lots of different things. The misperception in the media, I think the biggest misperception is that Israel is somehow some kind of a strategic asset to the U.S. And so you have to ask yourself the question, let's say that it was no longer Israel, but it was an Israel-Palestine, a democratic state, which I believe it will be. So is it less of an asset? And if so, why? In other words, does there have to be Jewish people there to make it an asset? If they're Palestinians, or maybe they're Christians or Muslims, then is it no longer an asset? Is this the issue? And really, why is it an asset? It's a country that's so small you can barely see it on the map. The U.S. has alliances with Turkey, with Egypt, with Saudi Arabia, huge countries that have lots of resources. So this tiny, dinky little place is the one strategic asset that needs to get all this money? I can't understand it. What I do know is this. The myth of the strategic asset is something that's also being perpetuated by the Israeli lobby, by AIPAC. Now, the question, you touched on all these different misperceptions. AIPAC, or the Israeli lobby, has had probably 80, 90 years of experience. My grandfather, I have a poster in my office where my grandfather was in, I forget where, somewhere in Russia in 1920 to come and speak on the issue of the land of Israel and the Jews in the land of Israel. So they've been doing this for a very long time, and today's AIPAC and all of its tentacles are the descendants of these, and they've had many years of experience. So they've been able to influence the education system, they're influencing the media, of course they're influencing politicians, and they do it very well, and that's what they're supposed to do. So they get the aid, they get the strategic alliance myth out there, and all these other different things. Now, how do you combat that? You combat that by exposing the truth. So, for example, here's one example of just how effective they are. Both my sons in high school took a class called AP World History, which is a college course that you take in high school. It's a textbook that's like this thick and this big. And it starts the day, the Big Bang, and it ends today. It's all in one school year. And in it, there's a little portion about the Israelites and the Hebrews, and it's all biblical. Not a shred of history. Now, we know in this country there's a big debate. Do we teach creationism or evolution? And most people say, well, we teach creationism in church, but evolution at school. Well, they might as well teach evolution, because the entire part on the Hebrews and the Israelites is biblical. Not a single bit of it is historical, because there is no historical proof that any of those things happened. Moses and Abraham and even King David and all that stuff, there is no historical proof yet at all. But it's in there. I think this demonstrates just how effective the Israeli lobby has been. You don't have to educate, you don't have to convince somebody that Israel has a right, that the Israelis today are the descendants of the ancient Hebrews. It's in the history books. It's already there. People know that Israel is a good guys and all this. So it's that influential. And the way you combat that is you just challenge this. You talk about the fact that there is no historical proof to that, because the two biggest claims are the Holocaust and the Bible, both of which I think we were able to refute today in this short lecture. It's not that hard to refute. There's no historical proof that this is true. There's certainly no proof that the other one is true either. So what are we left with? We're left with a racist colonialist ideology that occupies Palestine and is trying to maintain a racist state there with exclusive rights for only a minority. That's really, to sum it up. And that's how it has to be said. I think quite often people are afraid to criticize Israel, or reject Zionism because of maybe they're Jewish friends, maybe we'll offend somebody, but you have to say these things. And that's what it is. And that's how you combat it. I think that's the best way to combat it, is just to say it. And when the other side comes in and says it's not fair or it's not true, and when they come, it's very rare that they come to my lectures, but when they do come, they usually have very little to offer. Very little to offer. Because there's nothing, like I said, there's no way to legitimize what Israel does. Now, the reason I'm hopeful, you touched on my being hopeful, the reason I'm so hopeful is because I see things moving in the right direction. In other words, the Palestinian voice and the conversation on Palestine in this country has changed so dramatically over the last few years. 10 years ago or so, they wouldn't allow Jimmy Carter to speak at a church or a university because he said the word apartheid. Okay? Jimmy Carter loves Israel. He doesn't like the policies, he doesn't like the West Bank and all this, but he loves Israel. To have somebody like me that rejects Zionism completely and rejects Israel completely speak on a college campus or at a church, things have changed a great deal, and the audiences are getting bigger, and more people are getting interested, and more churches are talking about, maybe they're not passing, but they're talking about divestment resolutions, and they're talking about BDS. 5 years ago, you said BDS, nobody knew what that meant. Today, everybody knows about boycotts, divestment, and sanctions, and everybody discusses it. So this is growing. The churches are doing more. More is happening on campuses. BDS is becoming a bigger force and is becoming more well known and is doing more. The popular resistance in Palestine is getting more recognition, is doing more. And Israel is, the reality is that the reality of maintaining this very small racist state in Palestine is not sustainable. So that's why I'm hopeful, and I think, and I know very well that Israelis and Palestinians are going to do very well together. Now the next question is when this will be. I'm thinking by 2024. Does that sound good? And I'll tell you why I think 10 years. I don't think this can last to 10 years. Let's take a look at Gaza. Gaza today has 1.6, 1.7 million people living under a brutal, cruel, unjustifiable, inexcusable siege. A child in Gaza with an earache. Can you imagine being a parent, your child has an earache and you don't have access to antibiotics? If you drove 10 minutes from Gaza, you'd be in Ashkelon, where you wouldn't dream of not having access to antibiotics. Now, a UN report came out about a year and a half ago. By 2020, there will be an additional 500,000 people in Gaza alone. Are they still going to have to rely on tunnels to Egypt to bring in food and water and oil and stuff like this? Israel has no plan. Israel is ignoring this completely. It has no plan, which is why the UN came out with this report. And that's just Gaza. You have, I think many of you have gone through the Israeli Ben Gurion airport. You know what it's like. You know what it's like for Palestinians. The horror, the humiliation, the terrorism that they have to go through just to fly out of Tel Aviv airport. And it doesn't matter if and these are Israeli citizens, because the non-citizens can go through Tel Aviv. Only Israeli citizens who are Palestinians who are Israeli citizens can go through Tel Aviv airport. These are doctors, politicians, laborers, anybody. They go through hours and hours and hours of humiliation and terrorizing only because they are Palestinians. How long can this be sustained? How long can this absurd reality continue? And the world is waking up. So that's why I believe this is totally an absurd reality which cannot be sustained, and maybe not even 10 years. We'll see, but I think 10 years is a pretty good bet. And then the economic issues. Now, in South Africa, like I said earlier, we had, just like here in the U.S., you had an entire population. In South Africa, they didn't kidnap them. Here in America, they kidnapped them and brought them here as slaves. In South Africa, they enslaved them in their own country. But you have hundreds of years of really rape and pillage by whites, and in a state of impoverishment, which will take decades, if not centuries, to fix. And the level of education and so forth. You don't have that in Palestine. You've got 65 years of an oppressive regime, yes. But you've got a large middle class on both sides. Education levels, even in Gaza, education levels are some of the highest in the world. Over 90% literacy rates. Even in Gaza with all the difficulties over the last few years. And you have two societies that are ready to go to work tomorrow. Are Israelis going to try to keep control of more? Of course. Are the Palestinian millionaires going to want to suddenly share? Of course not. But you create a new reality, a political reality, and the challenges are far smaller than they were in South Africa or even here in terms of African Americans. So you don't have that history of hundreds of years of slavery and oppression. You have 7 decades of oppression. And still you have a highly educated society on both sides. People who can go to work, doctors and engineers and teachers and everything, ready to go to work. Laborers, of course, tomorrow. So will there be economic issues? Of course. Or will there going to be injustice? There's always, these are struggles that you deal with all the time. Every state, every country deals with this. I think the reason we need to be hopeful is because in Palestine, in comparison to other places, the chances for success are so much higher because of the reality, because of the two societies that are there. The chances for success are so much higher. Not to mention, if this room was filled with Israelis and Palestinians, you wouldn't be able to tell them apart. So that is, and you know, in South Africa, I think, I was just in South Africa. And what I saw was so many people of all races very proud of what they've done. And fully recognizing the challenges that they have, that they still have to face. But really very proud of their accomplishments. Young people, older people, all say how proud they are of being South African. How proud they are of what they've accomplished. And every time I'd sit in a restaurant or a cafe and there'd be, blacks and Indians and whites and somebody would remind me, 20 years ago, this was illegal. 20 years ago, a black man could be arrested for, doing something if it was considered skilled labor. It was an absurd reality. And things are improving, not fast as they should. Of course, there's a lot of challenges. So that was my impression of South Africa. And again, Palestine doesn't have those kinds of challenges. We have a much better chance of success because we have fewer difficulties. Okay, let's do 3 more.
The next 3 questions.
Equal human rights, one person, one vote. Population, 1949, 250,000 Palestinians today. Palestinians are the majority. One person, one vote. That's on one side. On the other side, you say that the way out of this dynamic, of this problem, is changing what's up here, changing what's here. My fear must go away if I'm Israeli. Or simply my belief in secular or biblical reality must go away. What have you seen? How have you seen this change of fear and the reality that most Israelis, I say most Israelis, I've never been there, live with? How is this changing?
Okay.
The question that propelled me into the line has been asked and answered, but I have another.
Okay.
It has to do with apartheid. You referred to the South African apartheid and charismatic leader Nelson Mandela. Do you feel, even given the changed circumstances, that some charismatic leader will need to proceed from either side here in this situation and really rally the troops and bring about what we all have desired? That would be my question.
Okay.
Is that person identified now? Do we see that person emerging?
Okay, thank you. Okay, one more. That was 2. We're going to have to top it because I'm losing my voice. So we're going to have to kind of cap the line there.
Toda Rabba for doing what you do.
Thank you.
You have a lot of chutzpah. And to me, the word Zionism is completely synonymous with manifest destiny. And also to me, Israel's behavior is shows that it's the U.S.'s largest military base in the Near East. And how have the Israelis treated the Falasha, the dark people Jews from Ethiopia?
Oh my goodness. Well, what would you expect from a racist society that suddenly has thousands and thousands of black people running around? The fear and the mindset change when the reality changes for most people. I had some special circumstances that helped me along, which is why I was able to change the way I did and go through the transformation that I did. And I put myself out there. Most people don't. Most people lead normal lives, and for most people, change occurs when the reality occurs. So most Israelis will not go out there and seek what I sought. Most Israelis are going to wake up in the morning one day. There'll be a Palestinian prime minister. There'll be Palestinians going to school with their children. They might have a Palestinian teacher, and they're going to have to see that the sky is not going to fall, and life goes on. it's a little bit like, if you're afraid of crossing a bridge, until you cross the bridge, you're not going to ever be able to overcome that fear. So the only way to do it is to force yourself to it. If you don't have to, you don't have to. Israelis are going to have to, because there's going to be a new reality. There is going to be a new reality. This is not an option. This is not a dream. This is not an idea. This is a reality. Palestinians are already a majority. Equal rights are next. A democracy is next. This is not something Israelis can get up in the morning and say, oh, do I feel like it or do I not feel like it? It's coming. Now, currently, the problem with Israeli society is, one of the problems is they live with their head in the sand so deep that they're completely oblivious to this, which is typical of racist societies. The reason racist regimes fall is because they can't even see the other side because they're so racist. So they don't appreciate the strength of the resistance, and then they fall. That's exactly what's going to happen. And they're going to wake up in the morning, and then they're going to see their kids are going to come home from school, and they're going to have Palestinian friends. And when they go to elections, they're going to have a choice. Some of the candidates are going to be Palestinians inevitably, and that's just how it's going to be. And that's when they will change. And I'm sure that's, and I hear from people who lived here in the South, in the U.S. when change happened, and in South Africa when change happens, and that is the process. That is the process. It's not something that they welcomed, but when it happened, that was part of what happened. The question of the charismatic leader is an interesting one. Palestinians don't go for that. There are thousands of charismatic leaders in Israeli jails, Palestinians. There are hundreds and hundreds of charismatic leaders that Israel executed over the years. Clergy, intellectuals, all kinds. And when these leaders come out of jail, they will lead the way they lead. I don't think there's going to be a Nelson Mandela. From time to time, somebody tries to say, oh, Marwan Barghouti or this or the other. But when we talk to Palestinians, they're not interested. They don't see that as something, which I think in a way is admirable. They don't the Arafat was put on a pedestal, and Yasser Arafat will always be on a pedestal. But after Arafat, it doesn't really matter who it is. It's the people who have the right ideas. It's the people who will fight for the right causes, who won't be corrupt, and will have something to offer. So I don't think it's going to be like that, because that's not the nature of what goes on in Palestine today. I certainly know, at least a handful of young Palestinians who I would vote for and follow. And again, Naim Atik, if he ever ran for president, I'd vote for him. But these are the kinds. There are so many of them. And some are religious, and some are secular, and some are more conservative, and some are, more leftist. It doesn't really matter. So I don't think it's going to be that. It's going to be the day the prison doors open, then there's elections, and then that's how it's going to be. And I think it's a process. It's more like a tidal wave, or a global uprising that's taking place. And it's not being led by one person. I think it's led by a principle. It's led by the idea of justice and democracy and so on. Well, the Ethiopian, Israel brought a whole bunch of Ethiopians of all types and all kinds of tribes and all types of situations. And to talk about them would take a whole other lecture. The only reason I know what I do know is because my sister lives very near an absorption. Israel has these absorption centers where immigrants come, they stay for a few months, and then they're supposed to learn the language and find a job. Ethiopians have been there for years. The Ethiopian kids were given to the ultra-Orthodox education system, which is even more racist than you can possibly imagine. So the kids come home learning that to be black is ugly and bad, and to be white is good. And then they see all the white kids after school being taken to after-school activities, and they're being put on a bus and sent home. So all of that. But what do you expect from a racist society? A racist state, a racist society is a racist state and a racist society. It doesn't matter. When the Arab Jews came, when the Jews came from Iraq and Yemen and all these other places, my people, the European Jews, looked at them, sprayed them with DDT, and then sent them to work in the docks. Whether they had an education, they didn't have an education, they were doctors or teachers or who cares. They were sent to work in the docks because they were dark. They were Arabs. And you see how they were dressed? Like Arabs. No suits, they didn't shave, they didn't look like Europeans, you know. And they were treated like Arabs. And they were told that they need to change their accent to sound, so their Hebrew would sound like my Hebrew. And they need to listen to the music that I like, not they liked, and eat the food, the tasteless European food, instead of the wonderful Arab food. That was what they were told, you know. On that, they stood their ground, by the way. On that, they stood their ground. But I mean, when you have a racist society, then you're going to have racism across the board, and that's exactly what is happening with Ethiopians. And it's very sad because in many places I've seen young Ethiopian students brought as part of the Zionist Hasbara. So I was in South Africa at this one university, and there were a bunch of, there were quite a few black students, and there was the group of black girls, and they wore this weird T-shirt that had the Israeli flag on it, and I thought there was something there I was missing. And when I approached them, they gave me this nasty look and walked away. So I asked the others, I said, what is this? Who are they? And they said, oh, these are Ethiopians that were brought here, paid for by whatever it is, the Jewish Federation or whatever it's called over there, in order to say what a wonderful place Israel is and how they absorbed them and they gave them freedom and all that kind of stuff. So it's very, very cynical. Okay, last couple of questions.
We have 3 more questions.
And that's it.
Then we give you permission to give brief answers.
Okay, I will. Yes, no, maybe. What can I say?
Very interesting talk.
Thank you.
Just a few comments of context. I have a very good friend who's Palestinian, and he said prior to the 60s that Jews and Palestinians lived in peace across the entire area. There's a movie called Valentino's Ghost that came out in the 1920s. It's a documentary that shows how the imperialist United States cooperated with Great Britain and France to divide up the Middle East and start sucking out the resources of the entire area. Okay, now getting to my question, it's my understanding that $3 billion is really $2 billion for defense and $1 billion for the civic benefit. And you say you don't know why Israel is an asset. $2 billion of business is wonderful business for the military-industrial complex. So my question to you is, how do you get the U.S. Congress, which is totally in bed with these military contractors, the neocons, to go against the best interest of these companies and stay elected? I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peled. Larry Grimm, a Presbyterian minister. I have a couple of observations and a question. The first one, I think your mother must be very proud.
I hope she is. Thank you.
The second is that I am so pleased you separated it as a political issue, not a religious issue there. In America, it's a religious issue. And it's a religious issue here because so many of us, our people in religion, live their religion as a mythic, literal experience. And so the narrative of the Promised Land fits into our mythic, literal understanding of the Bible. And that's one of the tragedies, one of the things we have a hell of a time transcending. Second observation is that there are indigenous peoples here living in Bantu stands all through this nation in their own homeland. And that is our narrative too. Question is, what does the apartheid wall represent really and symbolize for Israel?
Okay, thank you.
Hi. I just wondered if you know what, if any, role the Rothschild family has in the perpetuation of this domination by Israel.
All right. The fact that Jews and Arabs lived, or that the Middle East was really a place of tolerance between all three Abrahamic faiths, is something that Zionists are trying to hide, because Zionism and basically white European racism is the reason that stopped. They drew this rift, they created this rift between people who are Arabs. Some were Jews and some were Muslims and some were Christians and some were Armenians and some were Kurds and some were others. And that was the mosaic of the Middle East. When racist colonialist Europeans came and started messing around, then we had all these problems. But this is a truth that is often hid. In fact, one of the things that the pro-Israeli groups are saying now is, look at how the Arab countries treated the Jews and they kicked them all out. And trying to create some kind of comparison between the plight of the Palestinians and the ethnic cleansing of Palestine and what happened to the Arab Jews. The reality is, of course, that if it wasn't for the intervention of the Mossad and the Israeli government, then the Arab Jews would probably have stayed in Iraq and in North Africa and in other places. And they were quite happy to stay. You know, the reason the Mossad began interfering, and it's a long story, but there were Mossad units that were caught in Iraq. There were Mossad units that were caught in Egypt. There were other places where they weren't caught. My father's best friend was in an Iraqi jail for 10 years. And what they were sent to do was put bombs in synagogues and create fear among the Jewish community so that they would immigrate to Israel because they didn't want to go. And in the case in Egypt, the unit that was caught there, the cell that was caught there, they were in jail until I think 1973, and they were caught in the 50s. So that's a whole sad story that is beyond the scope of this lecture. But this is the reality. Jews, Arabs, Christians, Jews, Christians, Muslims, lived quite well and respected one another everywhere in the Arab world, everywhere in the Middle East. The Middle East was a place of tolerance. Now, I know that Israel is an asset. I know that it's an economic asset, and it's certainly an asset for the military industry and the arms industry. That's clearly the case. And it's well known, of course, that Congress is beholden to Israel. But I think none of this is set in stone, because we've seen these things in the past. I mean, when we look at Latin America, the reason all the dictatorships in Latin America were created because of U.S. interests and U.S. intervention. And probably, to me, the most striking example is when an American president promised never to leave and always to support America's most important strategic ally in Southeast Asia. And of course, that country no longer exists. It's called South Vietnam. One day American people spoke, and then the Congress spoke, and that was the end. So all the weapons that were going there and all the, everything, all the interests weren't strong enough to stop that. And I think it's going to be similar here. I think eventually people are going to speak, and congressmen are going to realize that the right thing to do is not to vote with Israel, it's now to vote against Israel. And so they'll vote against Israel. The reason, the reality changes, the politicians are going to have to change, Congress is going to have to change, and eventually there's going to be a president who's going to go along with it. There won't be a choice. So I'm not trying to make it sound as though I think there are no challenges. I think there's no doubt that this is going to be a tough uphill battle. And it's going to get dirty, and there's going to be casualties, and everybody involved is going to have to fight this thing. It's not going to be easy. Nobody's going to roll over and just die. Certainly not the military industry is not going to just give up this this cash cow. Certainly Israel is not going to give up. The Zionists are not going to give up easily. At the same time, I think, and I don't know if they're seeing this or not, but I think it's clear that they're losing. And I think they're beginning to spend more money now on trying to combat what is happening here and Sabil conferences and BDS and all this, and that's a good thing. And they're discussing it at the highest levels, which means they're realizing that their very existence is on the line now. So is it going to be challenging? Yes, of course. Are we going to have to deal with this? Yes, of course. And also, you know, once there is a democracy there, if America wants to keep giving them $3 billion a year, I can't imagine they'd say no. If America wants to keep giving them guns, hopefully there'll be a smart enough, you know, political reality where they won't want weapons, but, you know, it's nothing to do, you know, being stupid and all this is not a particularly Jewish thing. I mean, Palestinians can be stupid too. And when you have a democracy, they can make all these, you know, alliances as well. So we'll see what happens. But again, I don't think having a democracy there will necessarily change that. I mean, if they want to continue giving the money and doing all of that, they might still do that. We'll have to see. Of course, hopefully they won't. I think the apartheid wall represents this insanity that the Zionists have created, which in which they feel that they are a part of Europe. There's a little part there in my book where I tell a story that a friend of mine who's an Israeli activist, a woman activist, and she describes how this alien lands in Israel. And she, coming down from Earth, she realizes this is the heart of the Arab world, and it's an Arab country too. She knows that half the population are Arabs, half of the non-Arab population are also Arabs, because half of the Israelis there are Arabs. And she's walking around the bookstores to see, you know, learn a little bit about the culture. She walks into one bookstore and all the books are in Hebrew. And then she walks into another bookstore and most of the books are Hebrew and there are a few books in English. And then she walks into a third bookstore and all the books are in Russian. And she says, where are the Arabic books? And the storekeeper says, well, this is Tel Aviv. There are no Arabs here. Israelis live as though there are no Arabs around them, like there are no Palestinians around them. So you don't even get translations of Arabic books and Arabic writers and poets in Israeli bookstores. They live in this crazy reality, and I think the wall is part of that. It's almost like they're afraid of the East. You know, they want us so much to be part of Europe, part of white colonialism. You know, they don't want to be associated with what they really are, which is a part of the Arab world, an Arab country and part of the Arab world. So I think to a large degree, that's what the wall represents, and I think that's one of many reasons why the wall is going to fall. The last question about Rothschild, all I know is that the Balfour Declaration was given by Balfour to Rothschild because Rothschild was a friend. And the Rothschild family were Zionists from the very beginning. They contributed huge amounts of money to all kinds of projects within Israel, and they still do. There are lots of Rothschild, or lots of things that are named after Rothschild. Schools, libraries, dance, all kinds of things. So I know that they were always a very, very Zionist, very strong Zionist force from the very, very beginning. Thank you all very much. Have a nice day. The more I allowed myself to not be afraid, the more I allowed trust to come in. And then once trust replaces fear, then all kinds of bad things happen. The walls fall apart, there are no more divisions, there are no more us and they. You know, so it's a very dangerous process. Today, so I drive the trip I took that I described in the book was from Jerusalem to Bilain. Bilain is a small town where they have weekly protests. It's where the nonviolent popular resistance began. It's like a Mecca. People come there to almost just kiss the ground and see the people because it's really become hallowed ground in many ways. I go there all the time. I mean, I went there in 2005 for the first time. I spend the night there. I have friends there and so forth. The first time I drove, all I saw was danger. Every hill I saw, I felt there was going to be somebody behind that hill with a machine gun ready to gun me down. Today, I see the olive trees, I see the flowers, I see these beautiful green rolling hills, this almost, biblical landscape of Palestine. So what changed was not the reality on the ground. What changed was this, because there was no reason for me to be afraid then. Of course, there's no reason for me to be afraid now. But the fear and the wall and the big signs when you cross into the West Bank at every checkpoint and bring Jews or have Jews colonize Palestine, which is not untypical. I think a lot of colonialist, racist, and settler ideologies rested on the Bible, used the Bible as an excuse. But of course, we can't ignore the fact that religion plays a role in Palestine, in the Holy Land. I think religion can play a very positive role. If you take Sabeel, for example, if you take a man like Naim Atik, who I think is the future Desmond Tutu, I think is today's Desmond Tutu, really. Then you see the positive, powerful role that the religion can play. And there are others. There are Muslims and others that that are like that. But as we also know, religion can be very toxic. If we look at the settlers, for example, in Hebron, the very fanatic. What they did was, originally Zionism was very secular. After 1967, when Israelis had access to the heartland of biblical places, then there's this insane messianic wind started to blow. And all these religious nationalists began to emerge, and they were the first ones to go to Hebron and to Nablus and all these other places and establish Jewish, warn Israelis that crossing into Palestinian areas is a felony, it's life-threatening, and then at the end they have 2 or 3 exclamation marks. It's just you be sure that felony and death are very serious issues. And you're there and you cross, and after the first time it's scary. The second time you start to wonder. The third time you say, well, are they out of why is this sign here? Where's the danger? So that's what I describe. The role of religion, that's a question I get a lot. I think people try to turn this into a religious conflict, and I think it's very important to understand that it's not. The conflict is one, or the issue is one of racist settler colonialism, which is what Zionism is. The Zionists secularized Judaism. They said Judaism is not a religion, it's a nationality. Then they secularized the Bible. They said it's not a book of faith, it's a book of history. All the God stuff and all the faith stuff is nonsense, but it's history. As a nation, this is our history book. And then they said, well, the land of Israel is our nation, is our country. And that's how they created this myth of the Jewish people and all of that. And the justification to go, okay, so we'll do these 3, then we can do more. What I describe in the book is what I perceive to be a scary and dangerous environment, because that is how I was raised. And so I remember very vividly, there are two things that I describe very vividly. One is my first, and you may have been to Nazareth, my first trip to Nazareth, which is, of course, inside of Israel. They're all Israeli citizens. Almost everybody speaks Hebrew. Yet everybody's in Arab, and the signs are in Arabic. And it was the first time that I found myself alone in all these Arab, And then later on, an actual trip that I took, I drove by myself with an Israeli car, with Israeli license plates into the West Bank. And in both cases, particularly more the second one, I thought that was going to be my last day on earth. It's not because it was dangerous, it was because of this, what my sister calls a fear virus, that was implanted and is implanted in Israelis' minds very, very early on, and is typical in racist societies. The way racism is maintained is through fear and mistrust. And then what I found was that the more I let go of the fear, the more there was room for trust to come in. And this began in the dialogue group that I took part in San Diego. The less I was afraid, or the more.
You didn't describe the role of religion in this whole controversy, and I'd like to hear your perspective on that.
Okay, I'll take one more question, and then what I'll have to do is we'll put the stand up here and have to line up. I think that's the best way to do it. Otherwise, I'll be confused. So let's get somebody here. Okay, up in front while we're at it.
Thank you very much. I agree with everything you said, with a few caveats. I'm forced to ask you as a devil's advocate, what do you realistically envision as the type of government and cultural changes that will be necessary to carry forth this perfect vision? For one thing, a lot of the formerly known as Sephardic Jews.
You mean what government will bring it, or what government?
Yeah. How is this going to be implemented on the ground? And to be devil's advocate in particular, shall we say that there are Palestinian groups that aren't known to be terribly democratic, small d either? I have to say this in all reality.